My foster parents treated me like crap, so I obliterated their reputation in our small town. My parents were both killed in a hit-and-run accident when I was 10. My dad was only 39 and my mum 35. Neither of them had relatives who could take me in. We lived in a really small, church-going town where everyone knew one another. My dad had been the heir to a small fortune, and so I didn't really have to work. He didn't like the big city, so him and my mum decided to move to a small town where he could have an antique store. My mum was into collecting antiques. I would have had to go to the orphanage route when they died, but this couple from the church, who I will call Mr. and Mrs. Banks, made this big to-do in church about how a little girl needs a loving home, and God has given us this joyous task of bringing her up in our home and hearts. It's been a long time, and I don't remember if those were Mrs. Banks' exact words, but there was something cringeworthy like that. The Banks had their own daughter, Kitty, who was a year older than me. That should have meant we would be super good friends. But Kitty had her own thing going on and practically ignored me. She was a holier-than-thou type. The Banks received a stipend from the state to take care of me, but they also received checks every month from my dad's estate, which was supposed to take care of me until I was 18. When I did turn 18, I would receive full control of my inheritance. The Banks were not exactly cruel to me, but in private it was clear that they were just using me to build up their reputation in town. In front of other people, they'd fawn over me in a sick, cotton candy fashion that made me uncomfortable. They'd also make Kitty be nice to me in public, which she resented. The Banks would also put on a big show whenever social workers came to check up on me. They'd coach me before the lady would come, and tell me to praise how godly and wonderful they were. After the social worker left, they'd go right back to ignoring me and spending my dad's money on crap on the internet or on trips. It was clear to me, even as a tween and teen, that the Banks were only using some of my endowment, both from the state and from my trust, to take care of me. The rest they spent on themselves. As I grew older, I could see that my foster parents would pretend as though they had great business acumen, and that's why they had more money and could buy a new Volvo. Where I'm from, a new Volvo is an event, and take a trip to New York and buy fancy clothes for Kitty. When I was 17, I noticed that my foster parents were stockpiling away my trust fund money to pay for Kitty's tuition to college. Throughout this time, the Banks would never outright say so, but would heavily imply that I owed them, and that once I got control of my inheritance, that I should be godly and generous and give them some material compensation for all the work they did to raise me. I think they already got lots of material, especially since Mrs. Banks practically stole all of my mum's antiques from her store and kept them for herself, gave them to Kitty or to her other relatives. One thing my mum never kept at her store was an extremely expensive Baroque-era fine china set. Absolutely complete and worth tens of thousands of dollars. Not a replica, but the real deal. So real, Napoleon Bonaparte himself might well have eaten a steak off of those plates. Probably not, but you get the point. It was my china set, of course, but Mrs. Banks thought I was an idiot and didn't know that. She would always talk about how, this china set will go to Kitty on her wedding day. Mrs. Banks assumed that since I always dressed like a tomboy, I didn't care about all my mum's antiques that Mrs. Banks stole or gave away, that I just didn't care about the china set. When I was a kid, my mum told me that things were things, and not to obsess over them, so having the Frau china set for myself wasn't an issue. What was an issue was Mrs. Banks acting like it was hers to give away. Wrong, lady. So once Kitty went off to college, thanks to my biological mum and dad's money, I had to make my own plans. I had always done well in school and had actually gotten a partial scholarship to attend school out of state. The rest I could easily pay for with my inheritance, which I would very soon have control of. As per usual, Mr. and Mrs. Banks were haranguing me about how I owed them compensation, and since I was going to be rich soon, I ought to share the wealth. I figured that over the past 7 years, They probably stole or misappropriated more than $200,000 of my parents' money, to say nothing of the state money they misused. I think they more than shared the wealth. I never promised anything. I just smiled and kept a tally of every single bank statement. I got them quarterly, that my trust issued over the years. The bank's family never shared them with me, of course, but when I asked the actual bank for a rundown, they were more than happy to oblige. I also wrote down every single major purchase my foster parents clearly made over the past 7 years, with money that was clearly beyond their means as a housewife and an insurance salesman. Things such as a $40,000 car for cash, a used $20,000 car for cash that they gave to Kitty, trips to Hawaii, New York, cash gifts to the church that made them look super generous at my deceased parents' expense. I kept it all in a nice 3-ring binder. I already arranged my travel to my new campus. I didn't have much stuff at the Banks' house anyway, and had zero intention of coming back, at least to their home. The Banks knew I was leaving, but didn't bother seeing me off, because they assumed I'd come back to give them their due. I waited for our church's yearly antique sale extravaganza, set to begin in 3 days. Per usual, the Banks donated all sorts of random stuff, many of it knickknacks that used to belong to my mum and technically belonged to me. They were not shy about giving away my stuff and taking credit for it. While Mr. and Mrs. Banks were on one of their shopping sprees with my parents' money and away from their house, I boxed up the china set and brought it to church. I told the rummage sale committee that Mrs. Banks wanted to donate the priceless antiques for sale, all benefits to go to the church. This donation is made in the name of Mr. and Mrs. Banks. I was being fair. If Mrs. Banks was really so godly, she would be delighted that such a wonderful donation be made in her name. Sadly, I knew she'd go the other way, because she was faker than porn star implants. The ladies were flabbergasted, especially when I told them the appraisal of the set's value. I also told them that if they needed proof of ownership and right to sell, to contact the number of certain attorney in New York. They thanked me profusely and praised the Lord Jesus for Mrs. Banks's generosity. This would be the most expensive item in their sales history. Everyone knew no one could afford to buy the set outright, but everyone would love to buy the pieces piecemeal. Like, I got a cup and saucer, or I got one of the chargers, I got an egg cup. The Banks was supposed to work the sale the second day, and I wasn't there. What I did hear was that my foster mum went ballistic when she saw her china set for sale, and that it was a huge hit, and ladies from all over the country had bought pieces of it, and it raised so much money for the church. My foster mum threw a tantrum and said that I had stolen the set from her house. The ladies at the church explained that I had made the donation in her name, and she was getting credit for the donation to the church. My foster mum was practically yanking her hair out, according to what I heard later. She was trying to track down who had bought pieces and trying to get them back. Of course, she was unsuccessful. What she was successful in was looking like a grade A douchebag. The entire church thought that she was selfish and materialistic and acting very ungodly, especially the way she cursed her foster daughter. A week later, my foster parents received a package by registered mail from me and my attorney. It contained my binder where I showed my bank statements and also a list of their spending extravagances. It also contained a warning from my attorney that should they ever try to contact me again for money, that they will receive a bill and a court date. That was that. 10 years later, I work as a 3rd grade teacher. I'm married to an accountant, and we have a 3-year-old son and 1-year-old daughter. Kitty ended up working through college, and as we've gotten older, we've connected. She apologized for the way she acted when we were kids. We're friends now and see each other multiple times a year, often just for lunch. She's an elementary school teacher too, and married to an engineer. She has a 4-year-old daughter. Both of our older kids play together when our families meet. We both have our own wedding china. She's gone to a lot of therapy due to her toxic parents, she tells me. As for her parents, they still live in their small town because they're too broke to move. Their reputation is of being that couple who drove both of their children away and stole money from the poor little girl whose parents died. And they tried to steal money from Jesus when they whined about getting their Baroque china back. I hope your Volvo was worth it, a-holes. Our next story was posted by user gustavotherecliner, titled, "Bench tries to destroy my orchid. I bankrupt her and get her house torn down." Well, let's start a few years in the past. My great-grandparents planted an orchard. It is now at least 120 years old. My grandparents and my parents were really proud of the peach trees growing in it and did their best to keep them in good health and well. We always threw a big party when the peaches were ready to be harvested and invited all of our friends and neighbors to it. I loved those parties. The neighbors on the property to the south of our orchard were particularly fond of our peaches. They were a bunch of fine old people, and me and the old man, Sam, were pretty good friends. He taught me a lot about woodworking, with hand tools only. We had some great evenings in his workshop, and we finished many a good whiskies in there together. In return, he got a lot of fine peaches, marmalade, homemade peach liqueur, etc. Sadly, he died a good 10 years ago. Cancer's a real jerk. His wife followed soon after. Many suspected it was of a broken heart. They had no kids, so all of their property was left to the state, except his tools and whiskey collection, which he had gifted me a few weeks before he died. In comes Karen. The name speaks for itself. Haircut, attitude, binchiness, the whole deal. She bought the property of my late neighbors. We hadn't had the kind of money to buy it at the time, as we had met some dire straits the years before and all of our savings were gone. The first thing she did, before she actually moved in, was to go round and making demands of the neighbors of the surrounding properties. When it was finally our turn to listen to her gibberish, she told us that we needed to remove half of the trees, as the leaves were blowing on her property. We told her in a polite way that we won't comply to her demands, as the orchard is a vital part of our family heritage, tradition, life, and has been there for at least 120 years. She was pretty ticked, but did nothing for the time being. There are some things that you need to know before I continue with the story. The workshop I mentioned before was situated right at the border of our property. It was a small timber-framed building, at least 160 to 180 years old. The regulations in my state are pretty strict concerning old structures. Every structure over 100 years is protected, and you need a special permission to tear it down. Failing to get this permission can lead to a hefty fine. To get the permission to build a new building, it has to be up to code, and you have to ask your surrounding neighbors, and if they agree, you're good to go. Except, there is one specialty in my country. You have to keep a certain distance to the border of the property to allow emergency services full access to your property. If one of these requirements isn't met, the building is illegal, or at least only partially legal, and can actually be ordered by court to be torn down. That might come in handy later. So back to my Karen. After our first encounter with her, she did her best to pester the whole neighborhood. She got the neighbor's dog put down because he allegedly attacked her brat. It later turned out she faked the attack. The dog was the sweetest and most innocent dog you could imagine. A Bernese mountain dog, big, but a real teddy bear. Anyways, she later got us to stop doing our annual peach parties, as she called the police every time for varied reasons. Noise complaints, we had a band playing there in the afternoon. Arson! We lit a fire in a designated fire pit in the middle of our property. She called the ATF on us, allegedly making moonshine. My dad had a license to distill for our own consumption. In short, she was a real pain in the bum-bum, and after 3 years, we decided it wasn't worth it to deal with various officers and law enforcement agencies every time we threw the party, and we decided to quit. After she had reached this goal, she resorted to pestering us to remove the orchard. We didn't cave in, and some things started to get really fishy. Somehow, the tires of our trucks got slashed, eggs got thrown on our farmhouse, our cat disappeared and surfaced a few days later in a pretty rough condition. It looked like somebody had tried to cut his tail off. Don't worry, he healed up completely, but we actually couldn't prove that she did all that. Then came the day she made her biggest mistake. She had a company come in a sort of secret operation and tear down the old woodworking workshop overnight. 2 days later, they started building a big garage/recreational center/house right where the shop was. But she missed one fine detail, which got pretty important later on. She didn't ask for our permission, nor for the neighbors. A short while after, the trees right next to her property started to get sick. The leaves turned brown in the middle of summer, and the branches started to die. We lost 4 trees before we figured out the cause. Someone had driven long copper nails into them. We had a suspicion, but we couldn't prove it. So we put up some trail cameras. Perfectly legal, as it was on our own property. We caught her red-handed. My dad confronted her, she apologized, and my dad, being the way too nice guy he is, wanted to let her get off the hook. But not me. The nail she drove into our oldest tree was the final nail to her coffin. I started to investigate. I had some friends at the administration of our county and asked them to do some inquiries. Turned out, she hasn't applied for permission to tear down the old shop, nor for permission to build a new building. I further did some inquiries on the borderline of our property. Turned out, the old markers vanished over time and her building was about 3 feet on our property. After I had gathered all this information, I presented it to my parents. At first they were reluctant, as they didn't want to start a neighborhood clash. But after I recalled all the things she did to us and our neighbors, they were in. So, let the games begin. First we called the authorities on her for tearing down a protected building and presented them with all the evidence we gathered. Then we called the building authorities on her for building a building without permission, not up to code, and not only didn't she keep the required distance to the property border, she also built on our property without permission. Long story short, turned out the workshop hasn't only been protected because of its age, but also because it was a historical landmark, which played a vital role in a conflict back in the 1860s. She got sued for this and had to pay a fine equivalent of about $150,000. She further had to demolish her newly built building, costing an additional $50,000, got fined for this too, about $83,000, and had to rebuild the workshop on her own expense, which was another whopping $154,000, as it had to be period correct up to the smallest detail. Means it had to be built with the correct materials, with hand tools only, and to the correct dimensions. As you can imagine, paying professionals to build quite a large timber-framed building only by hand gets pretty expensive pretty fast. So all in all, it cost her an equivalent of $437,000, plus further expenses as lawyers, etc. This caused her to go bankrupt, so she had to sell the property in the end, which my parents bought, by the way. Last I heard of her was that she moved back to the big city. Our next story was posted by user TrinityAdams, titled, "My shift supervisor at work was a petty tyrant who treated me like garbage, so I got him fired and arrested." Hey y'all, I've been on Reddit for a long time but never really had a story, but I stumbled upon this subreddit and had to share. I work as a computer technician now, but when I was in college, I worked part-time at a well-known chain cafe. Let's call it Seattle's finest. Other than babysitting or odd one-off under-the-table work helping at friends' booth at Renaissance fairs, it was my first job. The manager, Eliza, had aspirations for rising in the company at a corporate level, so she was obsessed about making our store the finest, Seattle's finest. At the same time, though, she wasn't an especially effective manager at the store level. She didn't really know how to make all the drinks and had to constantly refer to the recipe cards, even though she was supposed to be an expert on everything. She also didn't really care to learn, which meant that during a particularly busy rush, she could never step in and help us out in making drink orders. She would just hole up in her little office in back, near the kitchen. However, she had a college degree, and our company's policy, at least at the time, was that only college degree holders could be the full manager of a store. She left the day-to-day running of the store to Stephen, the lead shift supervisor who had been working at the location for 25 years, since he was 16, and the only reason I'm not a manager is because I don't have a college degree. He never tired of reminding all the workers that the store would go to crap if he wasn't around. Stephen really didn't have to do much, other than delegate others to do things, and make sure orders were sent out to the suppliers, and to sign those orders in when they arrived. Our store followed standard company practice, and so a fixed amount of supplies was usually ordered in every day, with only slight variations to account for particular stores' needs. For example, we might order 60 chocolate muffins a day, while a company average is 100, because our store was next to a yoga studio, and the ladies who came in ordered less of the fattening items. Steve also wrote the schedule every week. When I was hired on, Eliza was the only one who interviewed me, and she assured me that I'd get at least 20 hours a week, 4-hour shifts, to coincide with my school schedule, and I only worked Saturdays on the weekend, not Sundays. During my 2-week training period, she kept her word. I'd hover right around 18 to 22 hours a week, 4.5 hours at a time. After that, however, since I was fully trained, she passed me over to Stephen. Stephen followed Eliza's pattern for a week or so, but soon he tried to schedule me in the mornings, which I couldn't do because of school. He pretended to get really angry and disappointed, and talked about how, in my 25 years in the company, one of the first things you learn is to be a team player. Well, I thought that was great, but I still couldn't work in the mornings. So he'd grumble and say, "I'll have to talk to Eliza to see what we have to do about you." Eliza would only occasionally show up to the store. Usually she was there in mid-morning and left well before closing. Steve would always open up the store. "I've been opening the store for more than 25 years, blah 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 blah." Stephen would try to suck up to customers and at the same time condescend to us in front of them. "Forgive her, she's new. You see what I have to work with? Raw recruits." Sometimes he'd outright call us idiotes if we couldn't clean things up fast enough, or make drinks quickly enough. Like, he'd be hanging out in back counting boxes, meanwhile it's midday on a Saturday and I'm running the register and making all the drinks, and our lineup is 10 deep, and he sent his other worker off to lunch and he himself refuses to help. "You've got to have your baptism of fire." He took himself way too seriously. He thought he was special because he spoke fluent Spanish. Since he worked in the morning, a lot of people who had early morning jobs would come in, and many of them spoke Spanish only. He thought it was his specialty that he could communicate with them. Well, my father is from Spain, and I happen to speak fluent Spanish myself. So one Saturday, when I opened the store with him, I started speaking Spanish to one of the customers, and the customer complimented me on how well I spoke the language. Steve looked like he was ready to murder me. Whenever customers would come in who spoke Spanish, rather than let me communicate with them, Steve would get up off of his butt and say, "I'll handle this." As time went on, Steve would only schedule me for 8 hours a week, like closing Friday night and opening Saturday morning. I thought, whatever, I'll just start applying to other jobs. I didn't tell him that, though. I knew he was giving all the hours to his favorites, usually young women who he tried to flirt with. I know, because he tried to do the same thing with me at first. He said that he could give me more hours, but I had to play ball. Nothing that I could actually prove in court, but he was hinting that if I go out with him, he would give me more hours. No thanks, man. You're gross and married. Well, Eliza was up for promotion to district manager, which meant she would oversee 5 or 6 Seattle's finest coffee shops instead of just one. However, in a whole team meeting one special Sunday, she said that our store was consistently losing product. She warned us to stop giving discounts to friends, stop giving away free cookies or snacks to friends, etc. She also said that if we planned to have some of the pastries ourselves, we were allowed a certain amount of free product depending on the hours we worked. We had to make sure to write it down on the store use board. At least during the hours I worked, I never witnessed anyone giving away free product, and I certainly wasn't using any of it myself. No one gave stuff away, other than Steve. Steve got a bonus every time the store use board was below a certain threshold, and he would always accuse us of stealing or giving away things. In fact, he said so at the store meeting, that shrinkage is caused by these rookies who think a company runs on fifis. It's a business based on cold money, and we're bleeding it when we steal product or give it away. Meanwhile, I always notice Steve giving free discounts to certain customers, giving things away. One of those rules for thee, not for me type of things. Another worker actually asked him about it, and he said managers had certain privileges. Dude, you're not a manager. You make $3 more an hour than me, and you've spent your whole life here. He also resented the fact that most of us who worked in the store were college students who would eventually move on someday to something hopefully more financially profitable. Steve would do this working class hero bit where he would talk about how college people were snobs, didn't know how to do real work, were lazy, privileged. He also mocked me for majoring in computing as a female, and accused me of just trying to get my MRS degree. He acted like he was kidding, but he was still really slimy. Then he went back to his homily about how business people's whole day would collapse without people like him to get them started the right way with coffee. I'm as indispensable to a large corporation as the CEO. Meanwhile, we're all thinking, calm down, Steve. You're a shift supervisor at a suburban coffee shop and you wear an apron with your name embroidered on it. You're not curing cancer. But anyway, Eliza's promotion depended on our store reducing its shrinkage. On a date a few days from our Sunday meeting, company bigwigs would come to the store and check out how well Eliza ran things. We were told to look sharp. The bigwigs would be in the dining room, chatting with Eliza, while the rest of us who were scheduled that day tried to look our best. Steve really didn't have any incentive to make Eliza look good, because as long as he kept overall shrinkage beneath a certain number, he would still get his bonus. But that threshold was too high for Eliza to get her promotion. Also, it wasn't as if Steve would become a manager if Eliza got promoted. The company would simply get a new manager as an outside hire. Informally, we'd call Steve assistant manager, but the company did not officially recognize him in this capacity. Since he was a long-time worker and worked full-time, he did get health benefits and a 2-week vacation. The rest of us lowly part-timers just got a store discount and some free food to drink while working. We got paid every 2 weeks, but we got tips every single week. If you never worked at a coffee shop like Seattle's finest, customers would throw money into a jar at the register if they felt like being generous. The tips would be emptied out every night, and eventually at the end of the week, all the money would be parceled out to all the workers, depending on the hours they worked. Since I only work a few hours, my tips were small, but at least it paid for laundry. My school starts a couple of hours after the store opens, and since I wasn't burning too much energy working, I'd get up nice and early every day. The store was close to my apartment, and I always walked there. It was the time of year where the moon was still out early in the morning. I decided I'd walk to the store to get my tips for that week. I approached the store from the alley entrance, but I intended to enter through the front. Store policy was that you could only enter the back way if you were scheduled to work. As usual, at that hour, our daily supply truck was pulling out of the alley, and there was a huge stack of daily supplies in crates outside the back door. Steve propped open the back door with a trash can and was carrying one crate at a time into the store's back room. My first instinct was to help him, but then I remembered that I wasn't being paid. And besides that, Steve was a total a-hole. I was fascinated watching him as he worked. Because he was usually such a lazy ass, I was hidden by cars and trees so he couldn't see me. He stopped working, but there was still a crate left at the back door. It was filled with what looked to be croissants and random boxes of granola bars, in addition to coffees and pastries, our store was sold 30-party nutrition bars, the kind where you can buy a box of 6 for $4 at the grocery store, but we'd charge you $2.99 for one. He was talking on his cell phone, and only a minute or two later, a beat-up car pulls into the alley. The driver pops the trunk, and Steve puts the crate into the car, and the car speeds off. Steve then goes back into the store. At first I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just a work-related thing that I didn't understand because I wasn't a shift supervisor. Maybe the person in the car was from another store, and our store was supposed to send those items to them. I decided to forget my tips for the time being and walked back home. By the time I got there, I realized that it was most likely Steve was just a thief. I went to school and forgot about it for a few hours. But every now and then, that day, I'd think about it again. The next morning I woke up and made sure I had my cell phone ready. I waited outside really early, even before the supply truck came. When it did come, sure enough, Steve did the same song and dance as the day before. He left one crate outside, coordinated with his accomplice on his phone, the same car arrived, and it pulled away after Steve packed its trunk with stolen goodies. I thought I was being really slick in recording the scene, but later when I reviewed what I had, it was way too dark and unclear what was going on, and if I tried to get closer to get a better picture, or where there was more light, Steve would see me and my cover would be blown. I actually worked that day because it was a Saturday. Steve was his usual douchewall self, but hearing him banter with customers, it reminded me of other pieces of other conversations I overheard from him over the past many weeks. Steve had a side business, or at least his wife did, selling snacks outside of clubs and sporting events. I put 2 and 2 together and realized that if Steve stole even one crate and sold off its items at a massive discount, he'd still make a pretty penny, and all of it profit. And he had stolen a crate 2 days in a row. Who knew how many more crates he had stolen in the past? I realized that if I told Eliza, she wouldn't believe me and Steve would deny it. I had to catch him red-handed. The approach I'd be making to the alley was too far to record him without being observed, but I saw that there was an apartment complex on the other side of the alley. If I could somehow get into that apartment complex, all I'd have to do was quietly hold my phone over the brick wall, and it would be close enough to record him. That was precisely what I did. Staking out Steve's stealing became my morning ritual for a week. Out of 4 days, he stole a crate 3 times, and each time I had him recorded. I wasn't scheduled to come in until an afternoon the next week. Now, all I needed to do was show Eliza my phone, and I'd nail this idiot. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be in the store for a while either. But then I remembered that the big company meeting regarding Eliza's promotion was coming up that Monday afternoon, just a couple of days later. I wasn't scheduled to work, but I knew I could talk my way into the back room with an excuse that I needed my check. Our back room has a computer where we clock in and out. It's just one window on the screen. If you click out of it, you have access to the rest of the computer's functions. One thing the computer always has running in the background is what we called Store TV. It was basically just a series of short infomercials about how wonderful Seattle's finest coffee was, how our beans are from plantations where workers are treated humanely, how we donate to underprivileged communities, offer funding to women in STEM, and things like that. The file was stored as a WMV file, and the store just played it on a continuous loop. Every so often, Eliza would obtain a new set of infomercials, and we'd loop those out. Our store has one big screen mounted from the ceiling, which faced out into the store, away from the registers. My plan, obviously, was to upload my video of Steve stealing onto the store computer. I had the files, which I combined at home into one big file of 3 occasions where you could clearly see his face and the face of the woman driving the car, who I assume is his wife, and how they are clearly stealing product from the store. Eliza and the big bosses were already there at the restaurant, so the sensible thing would be for me to say, "Excuse me, Eliza," and just brazenly interrupt her meeting with my cell phone video held up to her face. but I love a bit of drama, and Steve had this coming. So I see Eliza with her colleagues sitting at a table near the registers, where Steve is standing with a crap-eating kiss-ass grin on his face. The store isn't really crowded. Eliza sees me when I come in, and in full I love my staff mode says, "Oh everyone, here's OP, one of our newest and best. She's going to college for computing." Followed by a bunch of nods and ooh, ah, pretending to give a crap. I smile and mouth the words, "I'm just here to get my tips." "Oh, of course, OP." And Steve looks like he wants to slap me with his little D. But too bad. I'm going into the back room, jerkwad. Our tips are placed in little baggies, labelled with the amount in our cubbies in the back room, with an honor system not to go grabbing anyone else's tips. I grab my tips, $11.50, not bad. But I go straight for the computer. I have my phone's data cable and plug it into the USB port of the store computer. I upload the file as planned. I unclick the propaganda channel for Seattle's Finest and switch it to Steve the Thief and set the video for continuous loop. I come out into the restaurant, and as usual, no one really cares about the TV. I go to Steve and order a hot latte. Steve looks like he wants to stab me in the throat, but he still has the crap-eating grin on his face because the bosses are all there. He doesn't know that just a few feet above his head, there is a continuous loop of him and his wife stealing product in the alley every morning. I had made sure to include a time and date stamp on the videos when editing. He already had some hot milk ready, and all he had to do was pull 2 espresso shots. I had my drink in 30 seconds. I pulled out my wallet, but uncharacteristically, he smiled at me and waved me off. Eliza saw me and nodded in approval. Then I sat at a table not too far from where the bosses were sitting. Above Steve's head, his video was playing silently. Finally, the payoff. One of the bosses said, "Say, Eliza, that isn't our company video of our donations to minority scholarships. What is that?" Eliza looks at the video. Everyone else looks at the video. Mouths agape. Only Steve is still standing there, looking like a grinning ninny. Finally, Eliza says, "Steve, can you explain what's going on here?" Steve looks at the video, and for a second, like he was going to run out of the room like Usain Bolt. He didn't do or say anything, other than run into the back room. Seconds later, the video stopped, and a few moments later, it began playing again. Haha, Steve. I deleted the correct video, made a duplicate of your video, and renamed it as if it were the propaganda channel. Everyone in the dining room was once again treated to a loop of Steve and his wife stealing an entire crate of designer granola bars and pastries repeatedly. One of the big bosses said, "Eliza, let's close the store, right now." "Young lady, I'm sorry, but..." He pointed me to the door. "Who am I to argue, sir?" I walked home with $11.50, but felt like $1,000,000. A couple of days later, I get a call from corporate, thanking me for the information about Steve. "No, sorry," they tell me. They can't give me details about what happened, as it is a police matter. Anyway, as thanks, a week later I received $200 in store credit. A few days later I came in to find neither Eliza nor Steve at the restaurant. One of my co-workers told me that she heard that Steve was arrested for theft, both he and his wife. Eliza got her promotion because it was proven that the only reason her store had moderately high shrinkage was because Steve was stealing. However, because she was supposed to keep a close eye on Steve, she's being watched carefully to ensure that she's actually a good employee. Well, that's fair, she wasn't a thief, but she should have kept a closer watch on the store. The whole getting a full-time salary but only showing up for a few hours a week thing was not acceptable. As for me, the new manager got me my final check because I quit. I went and applied for a job on campus at my school's off-brand coffee shop. Same basic job, a few jerks here and there. I'm no prize winner myself, just saying, but I did make $1 an hour more. As time went on, I graduated school. I did eventually learn that Steve was not only stealing product, but was embezzling tips and tampering with the time clock to reduce people's hours and give himself more. He went to jail for 6 years, but his wife got a suspended sentence because they had 2 children under age 13. I learned this because the company I work for actually did tech service for Seattle's finest corporate office, where Eliza now works. She remembered me, and over the finest coffee in all of Seattle, she told me the whole story. Don't announce your engagement at someone else's wedding, or this might happen to you. Last summer, I was at a cousin's wedding. His bride and her family had been close with ours since before I was born, and the couple had known each other since they were toddlers, so it was a particularly exciting event for both sides of the family. However, after the ceremony was over and the party had only just started, one of the bridesmaids decided to announce her own engagement. The attention was immediately taken away from the newlyweds and brought to the bridesmaid, who I'll call Sarah, and her equally smug fiancé. My cousin's wife, I'll call her Emma, didn't make a scene or utter a single negative word about Sarah. She looked like she was on the verge of tears, but she kept grinning and acted very happy for the other couple. This was unusual, as Emma is typically quite confrontational and speaks her mind no matter the consequences. Sarah later picked Emma to be the maid of honor at her own wedding, which took place last weekend. I wasn't there for it, but my cousin sent me some of the best bits on Snapchat and explained the whole situation. This is where the fun begins. Emma's 2 much younger sisters were the flower girls at Sarah's wedding. At the very last moment, Emma switched out the white petals in their baskets to blue ones she had secretly brought with her. She told her sisters not to say anything about it or let the bride see them until it was time to scatter them down the aisle. Sarah looked very confused upon seeing the blue petals, which didn't coordinate whatsoever with her theme. But of course, she didn't say anything about it in the moment. Most of Sarah's other bridesmaids were also Emma's friends, had attended Emma's wedding, and were in on Emma's scheme. At the reception, Emma's sisters and the other bridesmaids were tight-lipped when Sarah began demanding to know why there were blue petals. The wedding planner ended up getting a lot of abuse for not checking the flower girl's basket before they walked down the aisle. Finally, it was time for the speeches. The speeches took place in front of a massive screen, displaying a loop of photos with Sarah and her husband, which had been compiled by Emma. Emma took the remote that controlled the presentation screen, and at first she showed some pre-approved humorous photos of Sarah with Emma and other friends to facilitate a couple lighthearted jokes. Then, at the very end, Emma said to Sarah that she must be wondering why there were blue petals instead of the white ones originally planned. That was when Emma displayed the last slide from her presentation. Emma announced in front of everyone that she was 5 months pregnant, and that she'd just discovered that the baby was a boy, hence the blue petals. The last slide? Her ultrasound picture. There were shocked yells and gasps. Sarah had a fit, but those involved in the scheme cheered so loudly that I sincerely regret watching the Snapchat recordings with headphones. Apparently, Sarah had been very nasty to her bridesmaids before, driving several of them away and forcing the others to pay ridiculous amounts of money for dresses. Emma and my cousin were eventually thrown out of the party, but they were all smiles. Sarah's fuming mother went to confront her outside, and Emma retorted with, Gentle, I'm pregnant." I reckon Sarah doesn't even speak to the majority of those bridesmaids anymore. And our next story was posted by OpenFaceClubSammich, titled, Girl I Had a Crush on in Middle School Bullied and Mocked Me for 6 Years. A decade later, vengeance. When I was in the 7th grade, I moved to a new town. My father was killed in a military accident, and my mom wanted to start fresh in a new place. We came from a small town, and our new apartment was in a huge city. My mom grieved my dad for over 2 years, but after that got back into dating and eventually married my now stepdad. with whom she is still happily married. He always treated us well, and I love and respect him. They have their own daughter, together my half-sister. I didn't adjust very well. I was active and happy in my old town, but in my new town, I was depressed and a loner. I entered school in the middle of the year when all the friend groups were already formed. I missed my dad a lot, so I just stayed home and ate and played video games. I got fat. Never obese, but I was chunky and out of shape compared to how I used to be. I liked this one girl who was in a few of my classes. I'll call her Lindsay. Lindsay was pretty and popular, and she was the first girl I really had a crush on. Being shy, I never tried to talk to her. As time went on, I made what I thought were friends with these two boys, who I will call Alan and Joey. All of us, including Lindsay, were in the 7th grade. I didn't hang out with Alan and Joey outside of school, but they'd let me hang out with them on campus. At least I didn't have to sit alone anymore. Alan and Joey were talking about which girls were cute and who they had a crush on. I eventually admitted that I liked Lindsay, but told them not to tell her. Later that day in math class, which I shared with Lindsay, a note was passed to me. It was from Lindsay. My heart leapt, although I was nervous. Did Alan and Joey tell her I liked her? When I opened the note, my heart fell to my feet. I get red when I'm nervous or sad. I was never more red than that day. Inside the note, Lindsay had written in block capital letters, "I don't like you, OP." There was a little bit of giggling in the room. I was so embarrassed I asked the teacher if I could go to the nurse. There was loud laughter as I left. The nurse let me stay in her office until the end of the day, which was good since my mum couldn't leave work unless I was dying, and I wasn't allowed at that point to walk home the 3/4 miles to our apartment, due to a recent spate of kidnapping stories in the area. I took the school bus home as usual. Kids laughed at me on the bus too. Not 2 days later, I get called into the principal's office and get lectured by the principal how a student complained that I was stalking her. I of course had no idea what happened, but eventually I figured out that Alan and Joey told Lindsay, and Lindsay decided to make a big production about getting me into trouble. Soon, everyone on campus started to call me the creepy stalker, the hillbilly, the white trash redneck, things like that. Lindsay got all sorts of positive attention for being brave enough to tell adults about kids who harassed her. The thing was, I was never officially reprimanded, and my mum was never actually called in to talk to any adults about what I supposedly did. The principal just told me that stalking was bad and to leave Lindsay alone. I didn't really know what more I could do to leave her alone. I never even said one thing to her, or tried to send any notes to her, or stare at her. All I did was tell someone I thought that was a friend that I liked her, and please don't tell her. I didn't tell my mum about it. But after Alan and Joey's betrayal, it was back to sitting by myself. In 8th grade, I still went to the same school, and it was more of the same. I was still known as the uneducated redneck creeper. Lindsay was still really popular and went out with the cool guys from our class. Alan and Joey were never in the cool kid group, and I suspect they both liked Lindsay too, and were trying to suck up to her. On Valentine's Day, I got one of those candygrams that students send to one another that they buy from student leadership at their school during holidays. Like, $2 will get you a card and a candy bar, and a student aide will deliver it to the intended recipient, along with a sealed message. I, at least, got a candy bar out of it. The message wasn't so nice. It said, "Stop stalking me, freak!" Thanks, Lindsay. By high school, I really hit my growth spurt and eventually grew to be 6'5". I eventually got quite skinny, so I began pumping a lot of iron starting in the 10th grade. I became really ripped. Alan grew up to be a benchy little runt, and he never messed with me again. Especially after Alan, the one who had asked me who I had a crush on in 7th grade, was whispering something to someone in class we had together in 11th grade, and looking at me and laughing. I said really loud, "Yo, Alan, you little bitch! You have something to say, you say it to my face like a man. Don't go whispering like a little bitch." Everyone laughed, and even the teacher didn't call me out or send me to the office. I think she was sick of the little punk too. I didn't really care to date in high school because, even though I was big and strong now, I was still awkward around girls. Joey actually came around though. In 11th grade, he approached me and apologized for how he treated me in middle school. He said that Alan was the one who told Lindsay that I liked her. He told me that Alan had a crush on Lindsay too, and was trying to score points with her. I thanked him, and although we were never really friends after that in school, I wasn't mean to him, and he wasn't mean to me. We were fist bump acquaintances. Lindsay was still really popular in high school. Not quite as popular as in middle school, because in high school there was more hot girl competition, but she still held her own. I didn't lack for attention from other girls, but more often than not, the girl would tell me that Lindsay told them I was a stalker and harassed her in middle school. Lots of girls accused me of that in high school, especially the ones I rejected. Eventually, since I was rejecting a lot of girls, some of whom were in the popular group, and Lindsay was still in the cool kid group at this time, people spread rumors saying that I was homosexual. I don't happen to be gay. Nothing wrong with being gay, but the way these people were throwing it around, it was as if being gay was an insult. Really disappointing, considering this was a huge, progressive city. I might have thought such attitudes were common in my old hometown, but it was surprising here. I'd sometimes find notes in my locker calling me a gay boy. Of course, no one, especially any guys, would own up to it because by this time I was huge. Not just in height, but I was also really jacked. Side note about that, I asked the custodian, a really chill dude, especially if you slip him a 20, if I could look at the surveillance videos of the holes that he had on his office computer. It actually pinpointed who was putting notes in my locker. It wasn't Alan. I would have loved if it was Alan, because I would have to cave his face in. It was actually this wannabe gangbanger who walked around in sunglasses and baggy pants and flannel shirts buttoned up to the top. Looked like a total tool bag. So I caught him in the parking lot one day with his girlfriend and said he forgot something. Then I showed him 6 or 7 notes that he had put in my locker. He tried to act like he didn't know what I was talking about, but I slapped him in front of his girlfriend and said, "Next time I find a note in my locker, I'm gonna make you look like a weak little crap in front of the whole school, not just your girl." I never got a note from him like that after that. But before he drove off like a deflated white cholo balloon, he admitted that Lindsay and her crew were behind it. Nowadays, and especially if my kid were the victim, I'd want him or her to tell an adult. But back then I had this snitches get stitches mentality and decided to just suck it up. Right around this time, social media was really starting to take off, especially that website where you had your own personal space and could have a top 5 friend row. Man, I wonder if that's like MySpace or Bebo, bro, that's crazy. Could use HTML to switch out music and have personalized wallpaper. Looking back, I think I preferred this space of mine to that boring book of faces. Most of my online friends were older than me and from all over the place. I liked having online friends because at least you could delete them. Just like that if you decided they sucked. Unlike high school, where people you have mentally cancelled were still on campus every day. Joey was my online friend and still is. He pointed me to a page he found on that website. It was a bogus one that had stolen pictures from my real account and was using my whole name. It was full of hateful, homophobic slurs and accusing me of being a stalker. By tracing this fake profile's friends, I could tell that it had originated from Lindsay's group. I flagged the account and it was soon taken down. To this day, I don't get why Lindsay found it so necessary to hate me so much, that she had to ruin my middle and high school years, just because I happened to like her a little bit in the 7th grade. Anyway, in high school, I wasn't a loner anymore. I was on the basketball team and track team and swim team, so I had friends, but I was never in the very top tier popularity group. Lindsay was in that top group, though she was mostly one of the hangers-on of the most popular girls in school. Like, she was in that group, but was never Beyoncé. And I thought I had my share of fun with girls in high school, never dated, just hooked up. I could never shake the reputation that I had stalked Lindsay. Well, I graduated and moved on. I went to college for accounting and eventually became a CPA. I still work out every day, and so I stayed in really good shape. I also continued to play sport in college, though I never had the desire, or talent really, to make it my profession. With the help of my awesome stepdad, who's an accountant too, we opened our own small financial service with 12 employees. We're doing all right. Eventually, a man comes in looking for a job as an accountant. Lo and behold, it's Joey! Haven't seen him in years, still looks the same, maybe a little bolder, but otherwise pretty good. We catch up, and since he's gone to school for accounting himself and has a good resume, we hire him. He does fine for a couple of years, and we've actually become good friends. We've put the past behind us. I went to his wedding, he went to mine, I went to his son's baptism, and he went to my daughter's. We're friends on social media, and neither of us keep in touch with people from middle and high school. Bygones are bygones, and time passes. One day, Joey asks me if I got a letter in the mail inviting us to our 10-year high school reunion. I tell him, no. And remember that the high school doesn't have any of my updated addresses, since my mum and stepdad moved a couple of times since I graduated. And anyway, I don't live with them anymore. Joey is taking care of his sick mother, so his wife and child moved in with his mum in his childhood home. He shows me the letter. Typical stuff, except, hey now, Lindsay is on the reunion committee. It has her email address and everything. I haven't thought about her in years. Since I'm in front of my computer, I look up her email address on FaceLibro. and it leads right to her since her privacy settings are minimal. Her current photos don't do her any favors. She's aged badly. It looked like she had a couple of kids and was married once, but is now a single mom and sharing custody with her ex-husband. She gained a lot of weight and doesn't look like she used to. Really, I wonder if it's even her, but the name matches up and the school history matches up. I was thinking how lol it would be if her ex-husband was Alan, but it wasn't. Alan was on her friends list though. Clicking on him, it doesn't look like he's amounted to anything. Never attended college, but that's okay if he does other productive things. But he doesn't. It seems he washed out of the army and has worked a series of menial jobs and now lives in another state far away. Seems like he's obsessed with just smoking weed and trying to date teenagers these days. Per Lindsay, from her updates, it looks like she's big on the dating scene, but hasn't found Mr. Right, and it's frustrating her because she has so much to offer. Like her crushing student debt that she complains about in one post, for her super cool and almost useless degree in fashion design, that she never quite earned because she fell in love and got married with some loser from high school, or how her children don't respect her in another post, or how she has several go-gimme funds just to raise the rent on her crap studio apartment, or her amazing, exciting career as a junior shift supervisor at that popular coffee shop, Galactic Bucks. Holy cow! I think my life got revenge on her for me, but I think this B needs a little nudge. I tell Joey no, I'm not going to the reunion. Are you? He says he will because he wants to see if any of his favorite teachers are still around. And he tells me, do you want to show off to people how successful you are now? Lol, we're boring accountants, not Navy SEALs or hedge funders over here. So I tell him no, but if you're going, say hi to people for me. Will do. The reunion is still a couple of months away. For what I'm going to do, I need my wife's permission. After I explain how Lindsay treated me in high school and middle school, about all the stalker and anti-gay stuff, my wife tells me, mid-breastfeed, to destroy with prejudice and in detail. Thanks, dear. I look completely different in the face compared to high school. Still, I don't want to use my own photos. So instead, I gather lots of stock photos of a particular male model. Sorry, dude, I hope you don't mind. Anyway, I'm sure lots of catfish used you as their hook, Mr. Inoffensive, conventionally handsome, buff German guy. And then I make a profile on that awesome dating site, Acceptable Cupid, after I learned that on the Libro to face, that Lindsay is on there. The idiot actually doxes her own username, she's that thirsty for attention. Right when I launch my profile, I get a few spam emails and desperate catcalls from lonely women. I ignore those and go right for the kill. I send a message to Lindsay, telling her how amazing and interesting she is. Since she's such an unattractive a person in every way, I don't think there's a long line of suitors vying for her attention. And I'm right. Within minutes, I get her reply. We begin a message exchange on the site, and I gradually gain her confidence, mostly by flattering her. She doesn't tell me she's a mum, even after several days of messaging, which is odd. She implies strongly that she's a career person and artist. Haha, okay, relax there, Lindsay. Eventually, I share a picture with her, and she fawns over how gorgeous I am. Thanks, innocent German model. I am glad she can't hear me laughing when I type that she is beautiful. As days pass, she begs me to give her permission to share my photo to her book of the face, where she is bragging about me. I tell her that there is a time for that. Soon she can share my pic, and I will share hers. I lull her into thinking I'm respectful and want to take time in figuring out us. Throughout this whole time, I keep giving her opportunities to tell me she's a mom. I get her to say, for the right guy, I'll make my existence only about him and me. Everything else is second place. I also get her to say that she can't stand kids. This is already a long story, so I'll try to at least shorten it a little bit here. Eventually, she invites me to her high school reunion. I tell her how much I'd love to go, but that I live in another state and can't get time off from my very highly paid executive job. Lol. Until a date a few days after. But I promise her that we will have a date at a very expensive restaurant. She's bragging all over her social media that she has a hot new guy online and has a date with him. Of course, her friends are begging her to share his pics, but she doesn't, to her credit. She does brag about how this will teach her ex a lesson that she can still pull the hottest dudes. Everyone online in her friend group, I was not shocked to see that most of her friends were other losers from school, and how she never seemed to grow up, were cheerleading her, telling her how much she deserved this. You sure do, Lindsay. I don't tell Joey what I'm doing a few desks away from him at work. Every spare moment I have from my job, I devote to messing with Lindsay, sending her messages about how beautiful she is, how I will take her on trips. Eventually, I learn her phone number. I hit the convenience store, let's call it 711, and buy a cheap cell phone with minutes card. I begin texting Lindsay about how I think she's so amazing, refreshing, so real. Just to see if she's still a hateful B-word, I tell her about how during my online dating, some guys will try to chat with me. She immediately laments how homosexual people need to stay away from straights. Okay, Lindsay, you're trash. I text her back that I don't mind when guys message me because I have my Acceptable Cupid account set for friends in addition to romantic partners. She immediately backpedals when she sees that gay guys don't offend me. Whatever, Lindsay, I know what you are. Anyway, Joey goes to the reunion with his wife. His mother is ill, but well enough to watch his son for a few hours. The high school is about 20 miles from our place of business. Joey tells me that all the expected people were there. He was sad to learn that one of the popular teachers had passed away, but most of the others were still working there. He saw a lot of the former popular kids. He texted me with some of their selfies together. Too bad Alan didn't make it, probably still chasing a statutory charge in his new home state. With a few exceptions, most of our former classmates looked like they peaked in high school. Sad considering they were all still under 30. I didn't ask him about her, or try to coach him on anything to say, but Joey told me that Lindsay, one of the officers in charge of the reunion committee, was bragging to everyone about this hot guy she was messaging online, and how she had a date with him. According to Joey, people were marveling about how unbelievably handsome the guy was, like a model. I'm glad that Lindsay was never the sharpest tool in the shed. Otherwise, a simple reverse image search would reveal that the photos were of a very famous European model. Joey told me that Lindsay was bragging about how the guy online was in love with her, and how they had a date next week, and how he was a rich CEO of some mysterious, never-named company. Joey told me that a lot of girls were encouraging Lindsay to marry him and his money. Although I appreciated Joey's updates, they weren't actually necessary, since Lindsay flooded her book of the face with tons of photos from that night, as did her crappy friends. Eventually, I spoke to Lindsay on the phone. Amazing! In middle school and high school, I never once really talked to her. I only told one D-bag in 7th grade that I liked Lindsay, and after that, it was all just gossip and rumors that she started. This was the first time I really heard her voice, and I wasn't even me. I was her Deutsch model. She told me how sexy my voice was. Really, Lindsay? Because I was pinching my nose and trying to sound different, not that she knew what I sounded like for real anyway. I told her I couldn't wait for our date, and told her which restaurant it would be. I also told her I was staying at a certain 5-star hotel. I said that we could go there after dinner, which of course, polite talk for, we will get busy on date number 1. I made sure this particular exchange was on the acceptable Cupid site. I could tell she was falling hard for me, especially the way she plastered her social media with updates on her dreamboat. Hey Lindsay, you've got 2 kids and you never post anything about them on social media. Are you ashamed of your children? Meanwhile, she's telling the world she's going to get with some stranger she's never met. Lindsay, a truly trash human. Over the following few days, she never did own up to having kids, but she did admit that she worked at Spacebox Coffee as a side thing, for fun, in addition to all of the art that she did, or she said she did, and having her own business. I assume she's talking about her online store at Etsy that she brags about on the book of mugshots, where she sells really crappy beaded jewelry that only drunk ravers might find appealing. By this time, she's given me her full name, and I've given her my made-up name. She says that her job at Lunabox is a total joke. Her co-workers are idiots, her manager is mentally deficient, and that she often takes home pastries at the end of the night, supposedly to give to the poor. Nah, Lindsay, I've seen your pics. You clearly be eating them scones personally. According to Lindsay, she's supposed to mark out expired pastries and dispose of them for various city code reasons. But she goes all SJW with me and tells me that why should all that perfectly good food go to waste? It's truly an evil company. Yeah, whatever, Lindsay, you racist, elitist, homophobe. Anyway, fast forward to our date. The restaurant is only a couple of miles from my business, and I scheduled our date for shortly after we closed for that evening. I scheduled everything in such a way that I wouldn't miss my wife's famous lasagna later for dinner. I parked not that far from the window, in a parking lot adjacent from the restaurant. I couldn't park at the restaurant itself, as it was an extremely expensive place that had valet parking only. As scheduled, I see Lindsay waddle into the front door, coming out of her rideshare. I had instructed her to give her name to the host and be seated at a specific table. I happen to know, because she said so on the Libro of the face, that she was ashamed of her beat-up 2001 Chevy Cavalier. I assume she expected her hot date to drive her home after an amazing night of what I can only assume is, with her, vomit-inducing and malodorous lovemaking. I told her I would be arriving in a Maserati. I see her sit at the table I arranged earlier. I see her playing with her phone, probably bragging about our date to whoever. After 20 minutes of stringing her along, I see my courier arrive on a red Vespa, just as he told me he would. The courier I scheduled to arrive at a certain time, 20 minutes after Lindsay's arrival. He wouldn't bring the item unless I texted the go-ahead, which I did. He texted me, "Here!" And I saw him take the bear out of his backpack. His task was to ride to a certain gift store I never really frequented, and pick up a small stuffed bear, whose arms could surround anything from a bouquet of roses to a box of candy to an envelope with $1 million check in it. The courier was then supposed to bring the bear to the restaurant host. The host would then, of course, bring the bear to Lindsay. The courier handed the bear to the host. I didn't see the handoff because that part of the restaurant was out of my vision, but I did see the courier right away after I received a text saying, "Done." I did see the host give the bear to Lindsay, which was the important part. I was parked close enough to see her face as she read the note I had typed and placed inside the envelope I had the bear holding, next to a fancy chocolate bar. "I don't like you, Lindsay." Her face, oh my god, her face! She looked like she was going to die right there. I received a WTF text from her. I started driving home. Text after confused text. 20 or more. She never knows when to drop it. Finally, I pull into my driveway. Wife and daughter at home. I hear their laughter, the good kind. I smell lasagna and my wife kisses me. She asks me if I had a good day. I tell her yes, most definitely. And then, before I take the phone's battery out and break the cell phone into 100 pieces before throwing it in the garbage, I send Lindsay one more text. "Stop stalking me, freak!" The next day I couldn't help it. I looked at Lindsay's social media. Set to private. I'm wondering if her narcissistic butt knew that it was me that played her. Especially since the mascot for our middle and high schools was a bear that didn't look too different from the stuffed one I had given her. I don't really care. All I know is that now I have closure. Especially after I sent the screen captures of our Alrighty Cupid messages, my own username and fake photo blocked out, to Child Protective Services, where Lindsay bragged about hating kids and told me what she thought about being a mom, and said she was going to be screwing a strange man on the first day meeting him. Maybe ex-hubby will get full custody and give those children the attention they deserve. Her boss at Galaxy Bucks was certainly interested in my recording of her calling him an invalid, and that she stole pastries that she was supposed to mark out at the end of the night, and that her company was an evil corporation and that they were a joke. Random call to her store a few weeks later. Is Lindsay there? Oh no, she no longer works here. Dang right she doesn't, Lamau. Go to hell, Lindsay. Hey, at least you got a candy bar out of it. Thanks for reading. P.S. A few days ago, my wife asked me whatever happened to that revenge that I had planned on that mean girl from middle school. I told her I moved on, and that it was too long ago, and that I needn't be petty. She told me how much she admired me for my restraint. If it were me, I would have cut a bee. One day, I think I'll confess. Maybe one of those deathbed things, about how I kicked a loser when she was already down and laughed while doing so. Oh well. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that one. One of these guys reads like a self-validating fantasy. This is a long one, and I hope you enjoyed it. Tell me what you guys think in the comments, and look forward to the next one. Bye.